We got a cabin for the weekend, and we brought all of the camera gear. Luckily, we were able to drive out here, so we don't have to carry all of it. So we were able to bring the heavy stuff this time. And I brought my time-lapse slider, and I'm going to show you guys how to set up a motorized time-lapse slider shot. This is a piece of gear that it can be a lot of work, and there are a lot of opportunities to screw up and do it wrong. So you got to be careful and kind of make sure that everything is set and kind of have all your bases covered before you let it go and before you walk away. This is a great video maker, motorized slider. This can be used for real-time slider shots too. So you can use these during an interview, or if you want to get some nice product shots or something like that. But it also has a time-lapse mode where it'll trigger the camera to take a picture, and then it'll move the camera a fraction of an inch, and then it'll trigger the camera and then move the camera and trigger it. And so by doing that, it takes an hour or so to get across the track. So then you can shoot time lapses that way. And that's really what I use this for most often. I modified this whole system and this whole bag to fit everything in here. The slider comes in a foam package that's all nice and form-fit to hold the slider, but it basically only holds the slider and the controlling unit. But it's a lot of extra work to have to put this ball head on here and to carry these tripods separately. So I just took off the top foam piece, and now I can fit everything in one package, and that way it kind of keeps everything together. So I keep all of the hardware in this bag, and then the more sensitive electronics and batteries I keep in a separate bag. And again, this is just a bag that I have from something else. It doesn't come with this red bag. The hardware, it's more durable and it can kind of be banged around. And it's not as sensitive to temperatures and stuff, but the electronics I keep inside of my backpack in a more protected case. These tripods are sold separately too. They don't come with the slider. And these are just some cheap ones that I got from Walmart. So we'll start out by attaching those. And then we have to find a place to set it up. And I kind of picked out a spot out here that I have in mind already. So right here. Oh, that's bad. Don't do that. One thing you should not do is drop these sensitive electronics in the snow. That's a bad idea. Okay, so I chose this spot for a couple reasons. With this slider, one of the features that it has is called parallax motion, where as the camera moves across the track, it can also pan. So it can start pointing this direction, and then as it moves across the track, it'll end pointing the other direction. And that's kind of a cool feature. It's kind of like an extra axis of motion that you get with a slider like this. And I'm going to take advantage of that with this spot right here. I want to start with the time lapse pointing at this sign up here where it says Hell's Canyon Ranger Station. And then as it kind of pans across this scene, it'll get the cabin, and then it'll end on the mountain peaks over there. So now that I've got my spot picked out, the slider is set up, but now the next step is to level it. Because you can get some kind of weird distortion if the track is at some odd angle. So you can see right now, this end is higher than this end, so I want to level it out. And I can do that by adjusting the tripod, just moving the inner shaft here. And I'll start out by just eyeballing it, and kind of readjusting the legs as I go. And then sometimes you're going to have to lengthen a leg, especially when you're outside, you're dealing with uneven ground. It can take some time to kind of dial this in. But these are the steps that you have to take in order to get a good end result. And then once it kind of looks good for eyeballing it, then I can use this bubble level that's built into the slider here. And then I can really kind of fine tune the level. And once that looks good, I'll just lock off all the tripods. And now it's time to plug in the electronics. So this slider comes with this controller box and a battery. And then a couple cords. So you plug the controller into the motorized dolly and try to avoid getting snow on your connections. And the dolly also has a lock. When I'm not using it, I lock off the dolly so it doesn't slide across the track on its own. So you always want to make sure to remember to undo that lock before you start moving the dolly, or else you can wear out your gears. So one thing that you have to do with this slider, and this is kind of a feature of these cheaper motorized sliders. If you get a really expensive one, you won't have to do this. But this is just kind of the price you pay for having a cheaper one. Every time I use it, I have to set it up basically and tell this control unit where the start and end point is. So you go into settings, you have to set your start and end points for the dolly, but you have to record a little bit of movement. So you hit the arrow buttons either direction just for a fraction of a second, and then stop it by hitting the center button. And then you'll see some steps come up here, and then you hold the center button to record that. So now the set start point is the same as the steps up here. So the controller unit has remembered that this is where your start point is. Then you hold the center button again to go back. Then you have to set your end point. Go down to your set end point, and then you have to send the dolly all the way across the track. And then I stop it when it reaches the end of the track. And hold the center button again to record that point. So now this control unit has memorized how far the cart has to slide to reach the start and the end of the track. Then hold the center button to go back again. And now you're in your main menu. And now it's time to get the camera. Okay, so now the camera's on there, and now I'm basically going to set up my shot and see how it's going to look through the screen of the camera. And basically what that involves is just going back and forth a bunch of times and making small adjustments to how the camera is angled to make sure that everything is going to look normal. So I kind of have the camera set up at my starting point. It's pointing at that ranger station sign, and then I'm just going to send it across the track and watch the screen, and this will kind of show me what the motion is going to look like. So right now the camera is starting out pointing at the sign, and it's ending pointing too far to the left. It kind of like goes past the mountain ranges. So I need to adjust the angle of this panning motion. And you do that by adjusting this bar in the middle. Right now it's kind of at the most extreme angle, so it's covering the most extreme pan that the camera can do during the motion. So I'm going to reduce that a little bit and then lock it off. And then I'll set my camera where I want it to end. and then send it across the track again. And we'll see, this time, we'll see if it ends on the sign. And that worked perfectly. It usually doesn't work out that quickly. Usually it takes me 3 or 4 tries to get that down right. But it looks like that angle is just about how I want it. Another thing to watch out for, if your camera has an automatic level feature on it, a lot of the newer cameras have that. It'll tell you if the camera's level or if it's angled or something. To pull that level up and then send the camera across the track and watch the level and make sure that that level stays in the middle the whole time. If it gets too far angled one way or the other, it's going to make your time lapse look not very good. So right now the level is pretty much in the middle. It's not perfect. It's okay if it's not perfect, but it should be pretty close. And then I'll send it across the track and just keep an eye on that level and see how it changes. Alright, so now I've got the slider set up. It's all level, everything's dialed in there. I got the camera on the slider. I got my motion dialed in. I have the panning motion dialed in exactly how I want it. Everything looks level. So now it's time to connect the trigger cord. This great video maker slider, it comes with a few different cords for different cameras. So you just got to find the cord that fits your camera. This is a Sony a6500, so I got the Sony cord here. This is the cord that tells the camera to take a picture. So this is important in the time-lapse mode because this is a control unit. This is basically what's telling the camera and this cart to do everything. All the motions and all the pictures that it's taking. So this control unit will tell the motor to move the cart a fraction of an inch, and then once that stops, then it'll trigger the camera to take a picture. Because you want the camera to be taking a picture when it's not moving. If the camera's taking a picture while the cart is moving, then you might get some motion blur. During the daytime like this, it doesn't really matter, but if you're shooting a nighttime lapse, when you're shooting long exposures, then that can be a pretty big deal. So it's really important that the camera's not moving when it's taking a picture. Before you plug this in, you want to make sure that you have all of your exposure settings dialed in correctly. Because once you plug this in, if you start making changes on the camera, it's going to be taking pictures while you're making changes. So you want to make sure that your exposure is all dialed in how you want it. And then this is just kind of a general time-lapse rule. When you're setting your exposure, you shouldn't just be setting your exposure for right now. You should be kind of predicting how is the sun going to change, what lighting conditions are going to change during the course of your time-lapse. If it's going to be way darker or brighter at the end of your time-lapse, you should kind of compensate for that. For example, if it's going to be way darker at the end of your time-lapse, you might want to overexpose just a little bit when you're starting out. And then on the computer, when you're editing, you can kind of adjust the settings to kind of balance that out. So I have my exposure settings dialed in. We'll plug in the control unit. And now I can set up my time-lapse settings. And this is another feature that's kind of cheap, I think, with this slider, is that there's really no good way to store this control unit. It comes with a little piece of Velcro, which I end up just wrapping around the ball head on this cart. So once the control unit is on the cart like that, I basically just let it go. If it's really windy, you're going to have problems. Because this is kind of like such a big profile and it'll catch the wind is going to shake your camera. So you want to set up at a time when it's not windy or when you can find some shelter. But now that everything's ready to go, now it's time to dial in the time-lapse settings. So I'm going to go into the time-lapse mode. And this is another thing that if you had a really expensive motorized slider, it would kind of do a lot of this for you. But because this control unit and the software inside of it is pretty cheap, in my opinion, it's not very user-friendly, and it takes a lot of experimentation to kind of figure out what settings you should use. So what I have actually done was, at home, I dialed in a whole bunch of different settings, and I let the time-lapse run, and I recorded how long it took for the cart to get from one side to the other. And that was basically the only way that I could predict how long it takes for the cart to get from one side to the other, which is pretty important if you're shooting a sunset or something when you need the time-lapse to run for an hour or whatever. Because the settings on here don't tell you how long it's going to take for the cart to move from one side to the other. So I actually have a list of notes that I've recorded in my phone that'll tell me how long it's going to take and what settings to use. So kind of based on the conditions that we're seeing right now, I think I want this time lapse to run for about an hour. So I'm going to go into my notes and I'm going to look up the settings that I need to enter into here for 1 hour. Alright, so I got my 1 hour settings. So for 1 hour, you want the interval to be 0.1. You want the time lapse to be 1. You want the stop time to be 5 seconds. So once you have these three entered, then you hit the center button to enter the time lapse. So once you enter the time lapse mode, here you can control the speed of the cart while it's moving, and for 1 hour I want it to be 40%. So I just hit the down arrow, bring it down to 40%. And then once I have all that dialed in, then it's time to start the time lapse. And to do that, you just hit the arrow button in the direction that you want it to go. So if we're going right, just hit the arrow button right. And now it's starting. Down here, it'll show you the number of photos that have been taken, this direction. While the cart is moving, it'll tell you which direction it's going. But once you hit the start button, then you're basically ready to walk away. This kind of explains how sort of confusing and not user-friendly the time-lapse settings are on here. It's ridiculous that you should be expected to just know that. The only way to do that is to run the time-lapse at home and just record how long it takes. I'll include all of these specifications in the description so you guys don't have to waste your time doing that. So I'm going to enter in these settings and then I'll tell it to run. So I have started the time-lapse and I can see that the cart is moving a fraction of an inch and it stops, and then the camera takes a picture. So everything looks good, looks like it's working. I usually stick around for a minute or two and make sure that all of these systems are kind of working how I'm expecting them to. Sometimes that happens, it doesn't work right away, and then you come back out and nothing's happened and you're expecting the whole time lapse to be done. So then at this point, there's not much to do more than wait. We'll go inside and let her run for an hour, and hopefully we'll come back. The camera will be at the end of the track, and we'll have a whole time lapse recorded.